TAG Heuer was founded in 1860 and it's a watch brand that most of you are probably pretty familiar with. You've probably heard of the iconic Carrera and the Monaco, made famous by Steve McQueen in the movie Le Mans. But this watch, the TAG Heuer Autavia, predates both of them. The Autavia began life in the 1930s as a timer bolted to the dashboards of rally cars and aeroplanes. That's where its name comes from. It's a contraction of automotive and aviation. In 1962, Jack Heuer, the CEO of the company that his great-grandfather founded, transformed the Autavia dash timer into a wristwatch. Heuer began to focus on the world of motorsport and concentrated on producing some of the most iconic and sought-after chronographs ever. Heuer became the first non-cigarette sponsor of Formula One after getting permission to place their logo on cars and on drivers' suits. With help from F1 driver Joe Siffert, Heuer became the watch brand most associated with motor racing, and drivers such as Mario Andretti, Gilles Villeneuve, Emerson Fittipaldi, and Graham Hill could all be seen wearing Heuer Autavia chronographs. Heuer not only conquered motorsports in the 1960s, but they were also innovating, and arguably produced the world's first automatic chronograph in 1969, in collaboration with Breitling, Buren, and Dubois-Duprois. Prior to this, all chronographs had been manual winding, as integrating the automatic winding rotor within the complexity of the chronograph mechanism was no easy feat. And what watch was chosen to showcase this new innovative movement? That's right, the Autavia. The Autavia stopped production in 1986 as Heuer was purchased by the TAG Group, Techniques de Avant-Garde, and became TAG Heuer. The Autavia came back briefly as a model in 2003 in a new form that didn't really hit it off with collectors. Then, in 2016, the new CEO of TAG Heuer, Jean-Claude Biver, the man who worked magic in charge of Blancpain, Omega and Hublot, announced the return of the Autavia. Biver is somewhat of a watch marketing genius, and he decided to let watch lovers decide the form the new Autavia would take. The Autavia Cup was held, during which time anyone and everyone could vote on the vintage design of Autavia that they liked the best. 16 vintage models were voted up or down through multiple rounds, and each was either eliminated or advanced to the next round, sort of like Pop Idol, but for watches. By the end of the contest, 55,000 votes had been cast, and the winner was the reference 2446 Mark III from 1966. This model is also known as the Rindt Autavia, as it was worn by the Formula One champion Jochen Rindt. The new Autavia was launched in 2017, just 1 year after the vintage model 2446 won the Autavia Cup. You'll notice immediately how visually faithful this new model is to the original from 1966. However, there are some really significant differences. First off, it's bigger in almost all dimensions by at least a few millimeters, a concession to modern watch tastes. With that size increase, it also appears more rugged, something that is backed up by its 100-meter water resistance, which is particularly impressive given the lack of both a screw-in crown and screw-in chronograph pushers. The other major difference is in the movement of the watch. The original reference 2446 came with a Valjoux 72 manual wind movement, as this Autavia reference predated the development of the first automatic chronograph. The Valjoux 72 was a workhorse movement and is still very much respected. In this new Autavia, we have a brand new in-house movement from TAG Heuer, the Heuer O2. It has the same tri-compacts or 3 sub-dial layout of the original, but it has the addition of a date window that I'll come back to a little bit later. I think there is a lot to love in this movement. It is automatic, and while I know that some folks love the feel and connection that you get with a manual wind chronograph, I think that this is a concession to modernity, and I also think it's a natural fit for the Autavia, because the Autavia, after all, is arguably the first watch to ever house an automatic chronograph. The movement beats at 28,800 vibrations per hour, it has hacking seconds, a quick set date, and a power reserve of 80 hours. The movement also has a column wheel and a vertical clutch. These are two very sought after features in a chronograph, as they mean that the operation of the pushers to engage and disengage the chronograph are buttery smooth. And also, due to the vertical clutch in particular, the timing is very precise and will not exhibit the slight jumping of the seconds hand that can be present on horizontal clutch chronographs. You tend to find that with horizontal clutch chronographs, you get a little bit of fluttering or a little bit of a wiggle in that chronograph seconds hand when you start and stop it, so it's not entirely precise. With a vertical clutch chronograph like this one, you don't get that wiggle, you don't get that fluttering, so this is really, really precise. The seconds hand of that chronograph starts and stops exactly when and where you push that start-stop button. So if I start this going, see a very nice solid action. It starts immediately and it stops exactly where that hand comes to rest. It doesn't wiggle around, it doesn't flutter. Again, these pushers have a really nice feel to them. They're smooth yet solid, buttery like action to them, very nice mechanical feel, and very, very positive engagement of the chronograph, starting and again stopping very precisely. The reset is just magical. Straight back up to 12 o'clock there, back to 0. The other nice thing to note about a vertically engaged chronograph is that whether you like to see it running all the time, or maybe you start it and then you forget that you've got it running by accident, it doesn't really matter, because in a vertical clutch chronograph, you don't get the same amount of wear on the engagement of the chronograph. With a horizontal clutch, you've got teeth meshed together, gears meshed together, and that creates wear. Vertical clutch is laid out differently, and if you leave it running, it doesn't really matter in terms of the wear on the movement. A final thing to point out on the movement is the TAG Heuer logo on the bridge. This is interesting, as this is the only place you'll see any TAG branding on the entire watch. Looking at the dial of this watch, it's got the classic tri-compax layout of the 3 sub-dials, and what is known as a reverse panda dial with the black background and the white sub-dials placed on it. It's really a timeless design. There's the chronograph 12-hour register with 30-minute increments at 9 o'clock, the running seconds at 6 o'clock, and the chronograph minutes up to 30 at 3 o'clock. There are the usual hour and minute hands that are rhodium plated with lume up their centre. The all-white hand is the chronograph seconds. There are a couple of things to note about this really beautiful dial. Firstly, there's radial snailing in each of these sub-dials that makes them look like little music records. Also, there's that date window that I mentioned earlier down there hiding at the bottom of the running seconds dial close to 6 o'clock, where it says Swiss at the bottom of the dial. Now, some watch collectors prefer to not have a date, but I really like this application here, as it's really well hidden in the running seconds dial, and it's quite small. I mean, you hardly notice it. It doesn't really detract from the lovely, beautiful tri-compact layout of the dial, and unless you really look for it, you don't typically notice it's there. You know, when you glance at the dial of this watch, it's not screaming at you that there's a separate little square or rectangular date window floating around. It's really nicely hidden in that running seconds dial, and I think the way they've done it, it's good. I mean, I think you're as well having it there, well camouflaged, as not having it at all. Another thing that I want to mention about this dial is in particular the chronograph minute subdial there at 3 o'clock. This watch has a corrected version of that subdial from what initially went out in the version that went into production. I've seen many photos and videos of the new Autavia with 2.5 minute marks rather than the single minute marks that you see here. I'm not sure why those initial 2.5 minute dials were produced and sold. Maybe it was a mistake, maybe it was a stylistic choice by the designer, but I found it to be really weird, really out of place on this watch. I mean, this is a chronograph with a racing heritage of precision, so it was weird to me that individual minutes were not marked out on that subdial, and instead the hand was left floating in white space unless it was 2.5 minutes that had elapsed on the dial, or obviously some multiple of 2.5 minutes. So where it's sitting right now, you can immediately tell, okay, 2 minutes have elapsed and the chronograph seconds hand is just passing 35 seconds now. The original version of this would have only had a marking at 2.5. So that needle in the minute subdial at 3 o'clock would now be sitting on white space. It would not be sitting on the 2.5 minute marking because only 2 minutes has elapsed. Now that the seconds chronograph hand comes round to 12 and starts a new minute, you can see that we've advanced to 3. So again, this was just very strange to me. I don't understand why they had those 2.5 minute increments. Not really a precise way to tell the time elapsed on this chronograph. So when I ordered this watch, I made sure that I was getting the corrected version. But hey, maybe if you've got one of those 2.5 minute increment subdials, maybe that'll be more collectible in the future. Maybe they'll be worth something someday because they came out as an error. Maybe there's a very limited number of them out there. So if you want to get one of those 2.5 minute increment ones, go ahead. The dial is a matte black with rectangular applied hour indices that are rhodium plated and have rather restrained application of beige superluminova. A lot of folks aren't keen on aged or old looking lume on the face of a watch, but I think it works here, and after all, it's not a very large application of lume, so I don't think it really detracts from the dial. I think it works quite well. The applied hour markers are actually really interesting. They're very three-dimensional and they actually have essentially 3 different kinds of finishing on them. The end of the hour index that is closest to the exterior of the dial, furthest away from the center, is where there is that beige application of superluminova. The central part of each index is then raised and brushed, and then as you move to the end closest to the center of the dial, it is lowered again and polished. The other thing to note on this dial is the painted Autavia text and the Heuer logo. These are again identical to the original, and it's interesting that this watch is branded as Heuer rather than TAG Heuer. The bezel around the dial is a bi-directional rotating bezel, and it's made of anodized aluminium, and it's quite unusual to see that on a chronograph. In fact, putting a rotating bezel on a chronograph was very innovative, and it's one of the things that set the original Autavia apart. You'll note that this is marked with 12 hours rather than with a tachymeter or minutes. These were all available as options on the original and are on some of the special editions of the new Autavia. The bezel rotates very nicely. It's got very positive clicking action, very nice, really nice mechanical feel to it. Again, a rotating bezel is very unusual to see in a chronograph, and I like it because I can keep track of a second time zone very easily. The crystal of the watch is a slightly domed sapphire crystal that has an anti-reflective treatment on both sides. The case of the watch is highly polished all over, in keeping with its retro design, but it's really nicely done. Very nice high level of polishing, and also a lot of beveling. For example, on the lugs here, you can see that really nice beveled shape to the lug. Very indicative of modern techniques, and that's not something that you would have seen on the original Autavia. If we rotate the watch around, you see that we've got mushroom shaped chronograph pushers, and the crown of the watch is signed, again, just simply Heuer. The rear of the watch has a sapphire crystal window into the movement. The movement is really nicely decorated with Geneva stripes on the bridges, and the column wheel is painted in red. I also believe that the rotor is made from tungsten carbide. The bracelet of the Autavia is what's often referred to as a beads of rice styled bracelet. It's polished stainless steel to match the case of the watch, and it's pretty much identical to the bracelet that would have been supplied on the original in 1966. It tapers ever so slightly from the lugs at the watch end of the bracelet, 20mm, to the clasp end of the bracelet at 18mm. The clasp has micro adjustment in order to get a really precise fit on the wrist, and it has double pushers. The clasp is also highly polished, and it has a really deep engraving of the Heuer logo. The bracelet on this watch is really comfortable, and I think it looks great, but I wish it had screwed links. It only comes with pins, collars, and you have to push them in and out in order to remove or add links to this bracelet. And I think that given the price of the watch, it's a bit of a miss that they didn't provide it with screwed links that would just make adjusting that bracelet so much easier. The bracelet itself is a $150 premium option that replaces a brown camel leather strap that has a pin buckle. So I think that for $150, it's well worth your money to opt for the beads of rice styled bracelet on this watch. You can always replace the bracelet at a later date with a leather strap of your choosing, or a NATO strap, whatever you think you want to put it on. So I think it's worthwhile getting the original beads of rice bracelet on this from the get-go. The watch feels great on the wrist. I have about a 7-inch or 18cm wrist, and the watch has a diameter of 42mm. I think it wears well on my wrist, but if you have smaller wrists, it may look just a little large. The other issue that some people may have with it is the thickness of this watch. This watch is almost 16mm thick, and so it does sit fairly high up on the wrist. But again, I find the height and the size to be definitely okay, and I'm really pleased with it. But I think that, given its size, given its high level of polish, it's certainly going to be a noticeable piece on the wrist. But I think it does still retain its vintage character. I mean, just look at that amazing, really vintage looking bracelet, the high polish on the watch, but again, really nice finishing with bevels and everything. And then just that great dial and that rotating bezel there, that 12-hour bezel, it all just looks phenomenal. It's a classically styled watch, and I think it works really well. But again, if you do have a smaller wrist, you may find that this watch is just a little bit too large for you. Although I do think it helps that the lugs don't overhang a huge amount, and although it is 16mm thick, it does hug the wrist, and it does try to minimize that height while you're wearing it there. Now let's go ahead and pair this watch with a Scotch. I'm pairing the Heuer Autavia with Glenfiddich 12-year-old single malt Scotch. But before I tell you why, let's talk a wee bit about the Scotch. Glenfiddich has been around since 1887, and it's a single malt whisky, meaning that it's made at a single distillery from malted barley, rather than a blend of whiskies from several distilleries using malted barley and a mixture of other grains. This whisky is at least 12 years old and it's blended from multiple barrels. It's actually a misconception that single malts are made of whisky that matures inside a single barrel that's been sitting there for 12 years. In fact, single malts are generally always blends of multiple barrels done in such a way as to keep the whiskies consistent in taste. Glenfiddich is matured in sherry and bourbon barrels, and as it says here in the bottle, it's renowned for its beautiful nose and its fresh, rich, complex flavour. I also want to point out that you pronounce this Glenfiddich, not Glenfiddich, as is often said to me by some people. Let's go ahead and smell the whisky first of all. It's definitely very fruity. You get a lot of fruitiness off of it, and you also get a little bit of oakiness coming off of the nose. Let's look at the colour and the legs of the whisky. You can see it's a really nice deep caramel colour. It's got thick and slow running legs as the liquid flows back down the inside of the glass there. This tells you that it's an old whisky and it's matured really well. Let's now taste the whisky. It's got a lovely creamy taste to it. It's first of all very creamy and very sweet. You then get a hint of that maltiness that's there, and also again a little bit of oakiness. The finish of the whisky, what you notice once you've swallowed it, is long, it's smooth, and it's a definite finish with a lot of oakiness and fruitiness in it. It's a really nice smooth finish. Glenfiddich is a consistently great Scotch. It's really easy to drink and it's good for beginners as well as more seasoned whisky drinkers. It's an entry point into the world of single malts and it really has a lot to offer. But it doesn't overpower the new drinker with either excessive wood or peat or smoke in the nose or in the taste. So it's really easy to see why this single malt is so popular globally and why Glenfiddich is actually the largest producer of single malt Scotch in the world. As you can see, Glenfiddich is certainly popular with me. Glenfiddich was established by William Grant in 1887 and the company is actually still family owned today, which is pretty unusual in the Scotch industry. Although TAG Heuer is no longer a family controlled company, Glenfiddich does remind me of the family story of Heuer and in particular Jack Heuer's hand in the creation of the original Autavia. That's why I've paired the Autavia with Glenfiddich. There's a sense of history and tradition in this watch that I think speaks more to the days of Jack Heuer and Formula One in the 1960s than it does to TAG Heuer of the last few decades. This is a watch with classic styling and a proud history that has been updated with modern materials and a really sophisticated chronograph movement, the likes of which are typically only found in much more expensive watches. This is by no means the cheapest automatic chronograph out there, but when you consider all of its great features like the sophisticated in-house Swiss-made movement and the overall great fit and finish, the Autavia becomes a really compelling chronograph. What do you think about the TAG Heuer Autavia? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, do please like and subscribe.